We all have our demons.
Not enough pain.
What's up, guys? It's Kael'Rian, aka Chugmug, aka Saladolin, aka Video Babo XE, aka Video Babo, aka Bobby D. How's it going, everyone? I'm here today to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, which is class balance for demon hunters in Legion and beyond. I find it very interesting as a topic because it's one of the first new classes where we haven't really seen a drastic shift for talents, abilities, or balancing since they've been introduced. And if what we've seen in the Battle for Azeroth demo at BlizzCon holds true, we may not actually see major changes in Battle for Azeroth either. That's a pretty interesting thing to see from Blizzard because it's pretty common to find that they add a new class to the game, often just to majorly shift around how they work from expansion to expansion. When you look at Death Knights, for example, first class added to the game back in Wrath of the Lich King. They were added in, they had this cool concept that they could be a tank or a DPS in any of their 3 specs. A lot of different ideas in play there. They had major reworks through Wrath even, with talents that improved their ability to dual wield, for example. Or changed around the way that things like Scourge Strike worked or interacted with stats at the time, like armor penetration. And then further, once Cataclysm came out, their whole design was drastically revamped to where they could only tank in blood. The other 2 specs were primarily melee DPS. And further, they kind of changed the playstyle of them such that the only real dual wield spec was Frost. And at that point, Frost was actually probably better with dual wield. They've made minor shifts since then, so they have definitely still changed some things around, and the gameplay of Death Knights has shifted expansion to expansion. But Cataclysm kind of signaled the last major revamp. Similarly, Monks kind of had a smaller scale of changes. They still did have changes made after their introduction, but they were introduced relatively stably. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were more of a modern class. They were introduced with the new talent system from Mists of Pandaria, so they didn't have to be changed a whole lot there. And their abilities were very, very different. They had a lot of different balance in terms of... Wow, I missed that mob. Anyways, they had a lot of different balance in terms of how they were built, because their abilities changed wildly between specs. It wasn't uncommon for ability balancing, because it took place very differently, to not need as much of a rework. There were some like shared healing and survivability things that changed a little bit, but overall, like, Monks were pretty similar, but then they received a lot of rework in later expansions. So Warlords of Draenor didn't bring about too many changes for Monks, but when you look at what happened to them in Legion, they shifted massively. Especially Brewmaster and Mistweaver. Windwalkers had little adjustments to make its niche a little clearer, but it's been more or less the same spec, with some very minor changes added in. There was definitely some tweaks in Legion that every class kind of got, but it's pretty interesting to see how they've held up. But I think Demon Hunters are even less subject to change, and we're about to see that here when Battle for Azeroth enters Alpha or Beta. So in Legion, Demon Hunters haven't really changed that much. When you look at what a Demon Hunter started with in 7.0 and compare it to what they have now, it's really pretty similar. There were some changes to talents, mostly for Vengeance Demon Hunters, and Havoc had some talent balancing done to make it so that the Momentum build was not the only de facto talent build for a 110. So now it's relatively equal in terms of performance from both the Momentum build and other non-Momentum builds like Demonic or Fellblade, which I'm currently using. So it's been pretty interesting to see that process. Vengeance, as I mentioned, did have major talent reworks, but even those weren't that heavy. They kind of redesigned 2 tiers of talents. They shifted around some survivability so that they had better overall damage reduction and performance for raids. And then they kind of left it where it is, and that's where it's been pretty much ever since. So it is a little bit different, and what's unique about this especially is that Demon Hunters being the second hero class to be introduced to the game, have been kind of a thought experiment for a lot of players, in that when you look at them, it seems like they're overpowered. They remind a lot of people of Wrath of the Lich King Death Knights, in that in many ways they feel pretty goddamn powerful and pretty unstoppable. Not necessarily fully unstoppable, right? But there's definitely power behind the Demon Hunter. But when you look at the balance changes Blizzard's made, and when you look at the overall state of their damage performance in raids, and their PvP performance, while they're really, really good, and probably need like a little bit of realignment, they're not like Death Knight super strong. And that kind of follows when you look at their representation as well. Demon Hunters are represented in raids, but not nearly as much as Death Knights were at Wrath of the Lich King launch. It's hard to say exactly why that is. I mean, there's definitely a perception among higher end players that new tanks are sort of a difficult gamble to make. When you look at some of the fight design in Legion so far, you can also see kind of a clear pattern that a lot of what happens to tanks in Legion, well, first of all, it does lend itself well to Vengeance Demon Hunters, but a lot of those same niches are filled by Blood Death Knights, which are characters that many high-end progression tanks already have geared up and available, and are more familiar with in terms of playstyle. There's also some additional survivability that you get from having a Blood DK, and that you do take a little less damage up front, where Vengeance Demon Hunter Sustain is largely built around taking a lot more damage and then healing a lot more of that back up. I co-tank with a Blood Death Knight, and my health dips a lot more than his, but my healing also brings it to full faster. And I have more options available to do that. My overall HPS is lower, but that's because the number of individual healing granting events are higher. I have Charred Warblades, I have Soul Cleave, I have all of the sort of toolkit of the Demon Hunter available to me, so I heal more often but for less. Where a Blood Death Knight has to very much like put everything onto casts of Consumption or casts of Death Strike, which works, but not nearly as much in terms of frequency of events. It's also kind of a thing that Death Knights have to definitely save Death Strike to use when they need active mitigation checks or have an active mitigation check rather that needs to be passed. Whereas for me as a Demon Hunter, I have separate mitigation from healing, and the unchaining of those allows me the ability to use more healing more often. So Soul Cleave often can be just hit on pain generation. You don't normally play it that way, that's not the proper play style, but it is an option that's available. Now, looking to the future, the interesting thing I've noticed is that in the Battle for Azeroth demo I got to play at BlizzCon, one of the things that kind of stood out there is that there aren't really that many changes for either spec of Demon Hunter. You lose your artifact active ability, so no more Soul Carver for Vengeance and no more Fury of the Illidari for Havoc. But what you gain in its place aren't really new abilities, but rather just a more cohesive rotation, effectively. It's a little weird to describe because it feels like there should be a bigger gap where, for example, Fury of the Illidari or Soul Carver are missing, but it really didn't feel that bad. There definitely is a bit of a gap there, but you have talent options that can fill that out pretty well. Your normal, like, actual in-world rotation isn't going to be terribly affected by losing these two abilities. Now, on a long raid fight where you have those abilities at multiple times, that's going to be a little more impactful, but overall, it doesn't feel like there's a lot missing there. The other thing is that there aren't really many changes to Demon Hunters in Battle for Azeroth. The demo that I played didn't really have a whole lot besides basic tuning changes, and it's difficult to really gauge those given that we had item squish on the demo, so everything was like kind of relative. But that was the interesting thing to me, is that in relative percentages and amount of change, nothing felt different. It felt about the same. If I hit Chaos Strike, it did about as much damage as I expect Chaos Strike to do on live, just looking at the amount of health movement that occurs. Similarly, as a tank, when I hit a full stack of Soul Cleave, the healing felt pretty similar. In fact, actually, one of the interesting things, and I'm going to talk about this in a different video, is that a lot of tanks have lost self-sustain in Battle for Azeroth. A lot of the healing capabilities that tanks have had in Legion are going away or are being neutered to a point where they are almost completely different. But for Demon Hunters, that's not really the case. I had a chance to do the dungeon demo as a Demon Hunter from both sides. I did the Alliance one as a Havoc Demon Hunter, and my ability to do damage, my talent selection, and loadout, all of them felt identical. Short of missing Fury of the Illidari and some of the artifact tweaks, it felt the same, in a good way. I didn't feel like the gameplay was alienating, and I didn't feel like it was different in an uncomfortable way. It doesn't feel like an expansion like Legion where you're going to have to relearn your class, which I guess is important for Demon Hunters since they've only had the one expansion, so relearning a new class is going to be kind of shitty if that were the case. On top of that, then, I did get to tank the Horde dungeon, Tal Dakar, as Vengeance, and Vengeance similarly felt really good and really pretty much identical to live gameplay from Legion. I felt very survivable, very sturdy, and when I compared notes with my Blood DK co-tank who tanked the Alliance dungeon for our group, the thing that I found is that he felt like his self-sustain had been shot into the ground dead. He still had self-healing, he still had some self-sustain, but admittedly just watching from a DPS perspective, it felt like he was having a pretty hard time of it. On my part, though, as I tanked the Horde dungeon, it felt pretty much the same. I felt like I was very easily able to self-sustain. My ability to heal is, in many ways, almost stronger in Battle for Azeroth than it was in Legion. Soul Fragments now heal for 20% of your health, so a full 5 fragment, I wanted to say stack at the same time, but a full Soul Cleave will heal you for 100% of your health. And that's before taking into account anything like Feast of Souls if you decide to take that talent. So you have the ability to get some beefy self-sustain. And on top of all of that, from just the fragments, Soul Cleave continues to scale based on the amount of pain that you spend. So your healing will scale up if you spend the full 60 pain on it, whereas if you do it at 30 pain, it's much, much less. But even then, the Soul Fragments now feel like the bulk of the healing. There's less of a disincentive for hitting Soul Cleave early if you feel like your life is being threatened, as long as you have fragments available. Fragment generation really seems to be the break point there, which is slightly different from live, but isn't that much different than the way that it plays at the high end. Currently, most Demon Hunters that are spec Vengeance and raids are probably using Spirit Bomb, and with Spirit Bomb, you have a different sort of fragment gameplay where you're still trying to wait to maximize fragments before hitting Spirit Bomb, and you're only really using Soul Cleave to get emergency healing that you need right now. That's still kind of the case in the Battle for Azeroth demo that I got to play at BlizzCon. The disclaimer there being that that was a demo at BlizzCon. We don't know when Alpha's coming out. We don't know when Beta's coming out. All of this could change before then, but given what I played and the state it was in at BlizzCon, I actually find that extremely unlikely. It looks like the game is pretty damn well balanced. Everything that I played felt polished and complete, like balance passes and work had been done there. It didn't feel incomplete or like there was major stuff that was missing from implementation. It was complete. A full, total game experience that you could play and enjoy. And that looked very much like what we'll probably get in a box in 2018 when Battle for Azeroth actually launches. So it's kind of interesting for me to see that, this is the first hero class that's been added to the game that isn't really going to get any sort of major rework going into the expansion following its introduction. Death Knights definitely got hit by the nerf bat hard going into Cataclysm after their massive overperformance in Wrath of the Lich King. They went through a lot of growing pains, but I think that the nice thing about that is even though that was so long ago at this point and the team on WoW has shifted pretty majorly, it feels like Blizzard has learned from that. this new WoW team, even though many of them weren't there for the introduction of the Death Knight, they definitely took some of the lessons that the broader team seems to have learned from that and made changes and adjustments to how they balance a class based on that. Demon Hunters are definitely like the flavor of the month for a lot of people, particularly Havoc and PvP, because they have such amazing cleave and ability to move around. But despite all that, they don't feel like they're brokenly overpowered. Death Knights could sometimes feel that way during Wrath of the Lich King. Not always, and not like they were completely unbeatable, but they were very strong. Demon Hunters are very strong, but in a different way. And as someone who's been maining a Demon Hunter for the entirety of Legion, it's actually kind of nice to know that I'm going to be going into a new expansion where I'm not going to have to completely relearn the class. My specs aren't going to change, my abilities and talents aren't going to change that much, and while I could be surprised in beta, the early balancing that was available and viewable on the Battle for Azeroth demo shows, as I mentioned earlier, that the game is probably further along than we think. It seems pretty damn complete, and a lot of classes have brand new talents and new abilities. Artifact abilities like Painbringer for Vengeance, for example, have been worked into just full-on passives. They exist in the game even without the artifacts to hold on to. So I'm really interested to see Alpha and Beta to see if this holds true, but for right now, I think that we are quite literally going to see the first class added to the game ever that is going to survive to the expansion following its introduction with no major changes. But I could be wrong, I might be wrong, and that possibility is definitely strong until a Battle for Azeroth Alpha drops. But anyways, I'm going to end the video right here. If you like what you've seen here, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and all the other YouTube cliches. I also stream pretty regularly, 6 nights a week on twitch.tv/KaleRien. So go check it out there. And I also have a blog up at kalerien.wordpress.com if you're interested in reading a lot of these same thoughts in a written form. But until my next video, I will see you later.
Thank you.